With a COVID pandemic raging across the whole world, and with the political soap opera unfurling in the United States, in DC and elsewhere, what with the US administration shenanigans, is it any wonder that the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh has lost the attention and the interest of much of the world today? But this morning, I want to come back to the Southern Caucasus, and I want to welcome you to number 13 of my YouTube episodes on Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, a quick recap to remind you where we are. In November of last year, after a bloody 6-week war between Azerbaijan and Turkey on the one hand, and Armenia and the Armenians on the other, a truce was brokered by President Putin of Russia. It's a 9-point truce that I've also shared with you, viewers, in my past episodes on Nagorno-Karabakh. But that 9-point truce or agreement needed further action. So guess what? Last Monday, President Putin of Russia invited both the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, and the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, to Moscow in order to discuss the next steps that are necessary in trying to calm down tempers, in trying to bring down the temperature of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh and in the Southern Caucasus, and also in trying to begin charting a future roadmap for where this region goes, not only in political terms, but also in economic ones. So the meeting did take place a few days ago. And of course, when the three of them met, both of them shook hands with President Putin, Nikol Pashinyan and Ilham Aliyev. They even embraced. We would have called that contrary to social distancing in the United Kingdom, I suspect, but there were no handshakes and a frosty demeanor between the Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders. One that was quite visible for me through the body language as the meeting progressed. However, no handshakes, no big surprise. After all, we are talking about a violent, vicious, and painful war for both sides, albeit for different reasons, and one that resulted not only in the loss of territory and the gain of territory, but also in 6,000 deaths, roughly, from both sides. So the Armenian Prime Minister focused on the future status of Nagorno-Karabakh and on the exchange of prisoners of war. Both of these issues are, of course, still pending. However, the Azeri leader was more interested in the future prospects and communication and connections between Azerbaijan and Turkey on the one hand, let alone on the fact that Azerbaijan had actually reoccupied, retaken the 7 regions or districts that had been occupied by Armenia in the 1990s, as well as the central town of Shushi or Shusha in Nagorno-Karabakh itself. So what did the meeting achieve? I'm no Russian speaker, so I cannot translate to you the statement that was made by President Putin. But what I can say is that a working group was formed that would be headed by the deputy prime ministers of both warring countries, and that will have its first meeting on the 30th of January. Moreover, they talked again of the transportation corridors and links, Azerbaijan with the exclave of Nakhichevan, and also for Armenia in relation of another railway corridor that would give it access as a landlocked state to Iran and Russia. Now, it's interesting because these were practical issues touching more upon economics, but then again, economic interests and progress might actually make a political solution of sorts a bit easier. But it also was quite a clever move by President Putin to have this meeting, because it showed that he who had brokered the agreement, he who had deployed some 2,000, probably a bit more, of monitors to keep the two sides apart in a region, in a land where they're pretty much living cheek by jowl, that Russia is in control, and Russia is back in the Southern Caucasus, and Russia has scored a hit when it comes to the competition between it and Turkey in this region. Of course, what was not absent from the minds of all the three participants at this trilateral meeting was what happens with the OSCE Minsk group. Will the future, whatever the solution is, the future solution of this region be still dependent upon the OSCE Minsk group, or is Russia now principally taking over the negotiations? And if so, where would it go? And in a sense, it's interesting here to not only to observe, analyze, speculate on what Russia might do next, on whether the Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders would be able to keep the peace, at least avoid more fighting, and work towards some sort of a progress for the whole region. But also it is worth noting that in those few months, very few precious months between the agreement in November, in early November, and now in mid-January 2021, 48,000 people have in fact returned to Karabakh. Moreover, some 800 tons of building materials have already been delivered from Russia to the conflict zone. That is quite impressive. If I add to that 1.5 million tons of humanitarian cargo, and importantly, quite importantly, some 470, 480 hectares of land have been demined or cleared of mines. That's not bad going. That's quite an achievement. Early November, mid-January, we're talking about at best 2.5 months, and yet there has been movement. So we haven't gone back to a 6-week violent war, then followed by status, by no movement, by a frozen conflict again. It cannot remain frozen. The Russians have invested too much time. Putin has invested too much time and authority in this conflict and the agreement. And therefore, I think that this meeting that took place in Moscow isn't such a bad thing, whether you look at it from an Azerbaijani perspective or from an Armenian perspective. And of course, I'm looking at it from the latter perspective, simply because I also happen to belong to the Armenian ethnic community. So let us hope that something will come out of it. Those transportation links, how safe are they? How workable are they? How valid are they? The movements that are being made, would they lead to the opening of any border? Would they encourage economic cooperation? Would such movements also strengthen further Russian presence in the region? I mean, I've spoken to people who've told me, you know what? if we Armenians are going to lose Karabakh, we'd rather give it to the Russians, let them have it, a little bit going back in history, because that was what had happened earlier in history, as you might recall from my earlier episodes. Let's give it back to the Russians. They will manage it. They will run it. We can live better and more happily. And guess what? We also might get Russian passports, which aren't such a bad thing, particularly in the region after all. So a lot is happening in the region. This is the first step. 3 toes have been dipped into an ice cold water in the hope that something will give and something will happen in the future. I remain hopeful. So long as there is no more violence, no more deaths, no more damage and destruction, no more prisoners of war, at least something is being achieved. And in order to conclude, let me also say that, as is my wont with previous episodes, I'm going to post 3 links in the description box for you to look at. They're short ones, but they'd give you perhaps an idea of this meeting that took place. The first one is a conversation that CivilNet TV's Ani Patjan had with Eric Hakopian. Some viewers might know that I constantly refer to Eric Hakopian as one of the observers, stroke analysts, stroke guests, stroke hosts of CivilNet TV. And he talks quite a bit, not only about this agreement, but also about the forthcoming possible parliamentary elections in Armenia. What would they mean for the country? And for good measure, he also talks about the storming of the Capitol in DC a few days ago. The second link I would put is directly related to this trilateral Putin, Aliyev, Pashinyan agreement that was via France 24. And finally, Deutsche Welle, which is the German equivalent of France 24, if I can put it that way, also reports about the trilateral agreement. So with those 3 links and with those few words that are pretty much food for thought, seeds for thought, no more and no less, I hope that there might be some progress for the future, that we will not stop there, lick our wounds, or rejoice over our victories and leave the job messy, because at the end of the day, one leader is living in Moscow, the other in Baku, and the third in Yerevan. The people who lost most of all are the people who lost their homes, who saw their homes being destroyed, who lost family members, who are living in places like Stepanakert and elsewhere. And remember, I'm talking from an Armenian perspective. An Azerbaijani speaker would probably give the flip side of this argument. But for me, what matters is not scoring cheap political points. It is simply to preserve the peace and keep the spark of hope alive. So on that note, I wish you well. I pray for hope. And I also implore you, wherever you are, to stay safe in this world of pandemic that we are facing every day. Take care and all the best.